Hello, my name is Jason from OISP, and today we're going to be talking about the complete IELTS. This is for the pre-intermediate level, and we're going to look at Unit 1, and especially the speaking, which focuses on Part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. Now, first of all, our learning objectives, our goals for today. We want to understand more clearly about Part 1, and especially how we can do well in speaking on Part 1. We also want to see some tips or strategies, some ways that we can succeed in speaking, and learn some vocabulary that we can use. We'll also hear a sample response from several Part 1 questions. So as you can see, this is the IELTS speaking portion, and there's a total of 3 parts. But today we're just focusing on Part 1. And as you'll notice, the total time is usually about 4 to 5 minutes. And these are topics that are usually familiar to students. Things like your hometown, your family, your hobbies, what you like to do in your free time. So many students find Part 1 to be a little bit easier for them to answer because they don't need to think too much about the responses. They're personal topics, and there's no preparation required. So now we'll look at some common questions that you might see in Part 1. So they go by topic in Part 1. So there may be a few questions about the same topic. For example, family. Do you have a large family or a small family? What sorts of things do you like to do together? Or another topic, traveling. Do you enjoy traveling? Where did you spend your last holiday? Or where do you want to go traveling? Or perhaps another topic is weather. Which season do you enjoy the most? Would you prefer to live in a cold climate or a warm climate? And are there any festivals associated with that season in your country? So we see these are personal topics and your personal experiences, and you can answer according to that. So now we'll look at a few tips that we can use to improve your score while you're speaking in Part 1. So the first thing we want to look at is the length of the answer. Now, some of these questions, perhaps there's only 1 or 2 words that you could use to answer the question. But for IELTS speaking, we want to use a full sentence if we can, and to continue speaking and perhaps give a few details or examples about that topic. So don't just use 1 or 2 words to answer the question. Give some extra information. The other thing we want to look at is the stress or the emphasis on certain words. So you want to emphasize certain words in the response. We can do that by perhaps speaking louder, maybe a little bit slower, or even by pausing, stopping quickly just before or after a certain word. So usually we will stress the words that answer the question. For example, if they ask, what is your hometown famous for? Now, the answer to that question for me, for my hometown, it's famous for its museums. So I want to stress the word museums in my answer. Secondly, we're going to look at some vocabulary that we can use. For example, look at these 3 sample questions that we'll be answering in just a moment. So the first one, where is your hometown? So maybe we think of some things that we can say about our hometown, some different words we could use. For example, I'm from, I grew up in. So those are some other ways that we can say it, some vocabulary we might use. Or the second sample question, what do you like about your hometown? So often we may start and say, I like, and that's okay, but perhaps we can use some other words. I enjoy, I love, my favorite thing is, I appreciate. These are some vocabulary that we can use for like. We can also change the grammar sometimes. Instead of saying I like something or I appreciate something, maybe we could say one thing that I like is, one thing I appreciate is, and then continue to speak. Or finally, the question, how is the area changing? So we might think of a word we could use for area, like region, or we could just say my hometown. And changing, we might have to use some speech to compare two things, which means that we might say something is more beautiful or prettier, things like this. So it might be good to get that in your head and be prepared to be able to compare how the hometown is changing from before until now. So now we'll look at 3 example questions from part 1 and 3 sample responses, so you can see how all of this goes together. So we're going to use those same questions that we just talked about. First, where is your hometown? And I will give the sample response. I'm from a medium-sized city in the United States called Grand Rapids. So it's in the northern part of the country, so in an area that has some harsh weather at times, and it's near Canada in the Great Lakes region of the country. So that's our first question. But remember, often they go by the same topic. So the second question, what do you like about your hometown? And here's our sample response. Well, there are many things that I enjoy about my hometown. For one thing, the cuisine is fantastic. You can get just about any kind of food that you want, and it's really at quite an affordable price. Also, I think it's the perfect size. It doesn't have the crime or the problems that a large city often has, but it's still big enough to have a lot of good things and attractions. So I think it's really the best of both worlds. And our final question, a sample question for part 1. How is the area changing? How is your hometown area changing? So the response. I think the biggest difference in my hometown has been in the economy. In the past, most people worked in factories, making cars mostly. Nowadays, the medical field is booming. In fact, many people come to Grand Rapids, to my hometown, for medical care. Also, the city has become something of a center of art. In fact, they have the biggest art competition in the world. So now we'll look at these 3 responses and see what we can learn from them. So first of all, let's look at some of the vocabulary. So maybe you heard some words that you're not too familiar with. The first one was the word cuisine. Now, cuisine is a word that has the meaning of food or a dish. We sometimes say the word dish or dishes. So it's cooked food. It's not the kind of food you would buy at the supermarket, for example. But cuisine is a nice word that we can use instead of food, especially if we're talking a lot about that topic. So once again, that's cuisine. Maybe you can try pronouncing it on your own. The second word we used was to describe the cuisine. I said it was fantastic. And that's a nice, easy word that means great or good. But many times students use the same words over and over. So they might use the word good, good, good. So using the word fantastic is a nice way to introduce some new vocabulary into our response. I said the food, the cuisine, is an affordable price. Affordable. So that has the meaning of a fair, a good price. It might be cheap, but it's definitely not expensive. It's a price that you are willing to pay for that thing. Then there was an idiom, an English phrase that we used. I said it's the best of both worlds. So this means when you're talking about something in 2 different areas. So I was talking about my hometown being big and small. It's kind of in the middle, so it has the good things from a big city and the good things from a small city. So that's the meaning of the best of both worlds, to have the advantages of two different things at the same time. The best of both worlds. And then a final word that I used, an adjective in the third question, was booming. So I said that the medical field is booming. So booming means that it's prosperous, it's growing, it's progressing. So it's big, but it's also getting bigger, is what booming has to deal with. So those were some of the vocabulary we used. Maybe you also noticed the words that we stressed. For example, when talking about the things that I liked, I stressed the word cuisine, that it's fantastic. When we talked about how the area is changing, we stressed the word the medical field, the economy, because those are the answers to that question. And finally, you notice the examples that were given. When you give some examples, it makes the answer a little bit longer. But don't worry about being too long. You can speak about like this is a good length, and the teacher will stop you if they need to. So now let's review some of these important things we've learned from Part 1, Speaking of the IELTS. First of all, what is Part 1 all about? Well, they're personal answers, and they're a little bit shorter than perhaps Part 3 or Part 2. And they're usually topics that you can speak pretty easily about. The second thing we talked about was how to get a high score. So remember that the length, 1 or 2 words, is really not enough on Part 1. You should speak in sentences, and perhaps a couple of sentences would be good in order to describe and give some details about that topic. We talked about stress and emphasis on the answers to the questions. And finally, some good vocabulary we used. I think the top 3 vocabulary that I picked out, that I chose, was to say something's affordable, it's a good price. Something is the best of both worlds. It has all the advantages from 2 different areas. And to say that something is booming, that it's growing, it's big, and it's getting even bigger. So doing these things, we can have a successful Part 1 IELTS, and hopefully this helps you to prepare a little bit for your IELTS speaking.